This video might be a confession. There's a kind of suffering that doesn't announce itself with tears or screams, but quietly settles between your thoughts. It's not exactly sadness, and it's not easy to explain. It's a heavy emptiness, an existential fatigue that doesn't come from daily tasks, but from the mere fact of being alive. A nameless discomfort that shows up the moment you wake up and realize the day will take effort just to endure. It's not a wish to die. It's a wish not to be, not to have to exist, to be spared from the burden of carrying such a sensitive awareness in a world that demands constant emotional armor. This feeling doesn't scream. It whispers. And that's exactly why it goes unnoticed by almost everyone around. While others live, produce, interact, and follow their routines with apparent ease, the one who carries this wish not to exist feels like an outsider in reality. Like someone thrown here by mistake, without a manual, without preparation, without anesthesia. It's as if existence itself weighs too much. Every gesture takes more energy than you have. Every social interaction requires more presence than you can give. And every silence hides a question you can't seem to silence. What am I doing here? It's hard to explain this kind of pain without being misunderstood, because it doesn't fit into the usual definitions of suffering. It's not grief, or a loss, or a visible crisis. It's an internal fracture, a crack between who you are and who the world expects you to be. And the more you try to ignore that fracture, the wider it gets. There are days when just being conscious feels like punishment. The body functions, the mind responds, but inside, everything is on hold, like living is just fulfilling a contract no one remembers signing. This desire to disappear is a real response to a life that often becomes unbearable in its rigidity, its repetition, its demand for constant functionality. And those who feel this truly feel it. They feel it in their body, in their thoughts, in their soul. And maybe this is the first truth that needs to be said. It's not insanity to want to stop existing for a while. Insanity is having to violate yourself every day just to look okay in a world that doesn't know how to handle the invisible. Living with the feeling that you don't belong anywhere is one of the quietest forms of suffering. Not because there's a lack of love or opportunities, but because there's a lack of resonance. As if everything in the world operates on one frequency and you vibrate on another. Conversations feel rehearsed. Encounters rushed. Relationships too shallow to hold the complexity that lives inside you. You try to adapt, to laugh at the right time, to respond as expected, to meet social demands. But inside, it feels like you're in a play where you never learned the script. That disconnection isn't arrogance or disinterest. It's heightened perception. A gaze that sees too much, hears too much, feels too much, and because of that, tires quickly. The world seems to work better for those who don't question, who don't dig deep, who aren't so affected by what they see or feel. But when you're made of layers, everything gains weight. A poorly timed comment can hurt for days. A cold gesture can become an abyss. A silence can feel like rejection, even if it wasn't meant that way. And so, you start to shut down. You become cautious, measuring your words, editing yourself to avoid being a burden. That's when the desire to retreat appears, not out of contempt for others, but from exhaustion. There's a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from doing, but from pretending, from the ongoing effort to try to fit into structures that were never made for you. Sometimes all you want is a break from that effort, a place where you don't have to smile just to keep others from worrying, where silence isn't mistaken for coldness, where intensity isn't a reason for distance. But that place almost never exists, and that's why the wish not to exist shows up as a silent scream. When you realize you have to shrink yourself to be accepted, something inside begins to die slowly. Your spontaneity, your joy, your confidence. Everything starts being replaced by defense mechanisms that, although they protect, also imprison. And over time, what's left is the constant feeling of being a stranger, even at home, even with friends, even with yourself. But suffering doesn't always come from something visible. Sometimes it hides behind a life that looks perfectly normal. You wake up, do what's expected, smile in photos, but something inside remains unsettled, like something essential got lost along the way. For many people, living has become a chain of repetitions that barely make sense. Wake up, work, perform, produce, please. And at the end of the day, silence comes back to echo inside your chest with a question no one else hears. Is this really all there is? There are moments when you look back at your own story and even recognize your achievements, your loved ones, the beautiful memories. But still, something doesn't quite fit. As if all those experiences happened to someone you once were, but no longer are. Life becomes a series of obligations disguised as goals, a string of attempts to fill a void that always seems to slip through your fingers. What others see as success feels to you like just another step on a staircase leading nowhere. This isn't ingratitude. It's clarity. It's the realization that living just to meet expectations, whether external or internal, wears down the soul. It feels like being trapped in a cycle with no break, where even the good moments are laced with a constant restlessness. Nothing feels entirely enough. Nothing offers true rest. And when all of that builds up, a quiet desire begins to grow, a desire to disconnect for a while, to disappear from demands, appearances, social roles, to just exist without having to carry the weight of a life that doesn't feel tailor-made for you. Of course, there is beauty. Of course, there is love. But even the noblest feelings, when lived under constant pressure, become hard to maintain. Love becomes exhausting. Togetherness becomes heavy. Small joys become rare. And then, even when you're surrounded by everything that's supposed to bring meaning, you feel like something essential is still missing. It's not that life is bad. It's that it's lost its texture, its vibration, its sparkle. This awareness doesn't show up overnight. It builds slowly as life becomes increasingly automated. And when everything turns into function, into role, into demand, and the soul no longer has space, that's when living starts to feel harder than it should. There are people who don't just live through what happens around them, they absorb it. The environment, the tone of voice, the choice of words, the smallest gestures, the silences between phrases, everything hits hard. Everything gets in. And little by little, that creates an overload that's not easy to explain. It's not about being overly sensitive, as many like to say. It's a heightened form of perception that bypasses the skin, goes through the mind, and lands straight in the core of your being, uninvited. That way of feeling turns life into an intense field, where even small events can echo for days. An unresolved conversation, a careless phrase, an expression on someone's face, nothing goes unnoticed. It's like the world is always on maximum volume, even when it seems quiet. And living like this isn't a choice. It's a trait, a characteristic of the soul that senses things early, feels them deeply, and takes longer to digest them. The problem is, modern life wasn't built for people who feel like this. Days move fast, connections are utilitarian, interactions are efficient. There's no time to process, to reflect, to breathe. Sensitivity becomes a burden in a system that values emotional speed. And the result is a different kind of exhaustion. Not the physical kind that a good night's sleep can fix. It's a deep internal fatigue. The kind that comes from spending an entire day filtering the world with all your senses wide open. People who feel everything all the time eventually start to withdraw, not because they want distance but because they need protection. It's a way to preserve what's left of their energy, clarity, and balance. But that withdrawal isn't always understood. To others, it looks like coldness. But to the one living it, it's about emotional survival. Being around others requires a kind of effort that most don't see. And when that effort isn't respected, everything inside begins to unravel. There are days when even an unanswered message can echo like rejection. A subtle shift in someone's gaze can reopen old wounds. And you know you're feeling too much, but you can't help it, because it's not about control. It's about who you are. And that's when the desire to disappear begins to creep in, a yearning to disconnect for a moment from everything that unintentionally hurts. Few pains are harder to bear than the feeling of not being understood. And it's not just about being heard, it's about being truly seen by another. To be looked at with presence, without rush. To be able to speak what you feel without having to soften it, translate it, or justify it. But for someone who feels deeply, that experience is rare. Most of the time, speaking is a lonely act of courage that ends in the void of rushed replies, pre-packaged advice, or awkward silences. Over time, that lack of true connection becomes a wound. One that doesn't show on the outside, but eats away from within. Because when the attempt to reveal yourself meets indifference, it creates a kind of disheartenment. As if the world is saying without words, there's no room for your truth here. And in the face of that, something pulls back. Something goes silent. And that silence isn't just the choice not to speak, it's the fear of speaking and, once again, not being heard. Little by little, you start to hide parts of yourself. You avoid certain topics, simplify your emotions, choose your words more carefully than you should. Not to manipulate, but to protect. And that constant filter, while it shields you, also separates you. The gap between what you feel and what you can express widens, creating a chasm between you and the world. And in that chasm, the desire to simply not be begins to grow. Not out of disdain for others, but as a way to escape the constant feeling of being misunderstood. Many times, people mistake this kind of pain for drama, weakness, or emotional neediness. But what's truly at stake is something far more essential: the desire to exist fully, without having to split into acceptable versions. Because there is nothing more dehumanizing than realizing that, in order to be accepted, you have to amputate yourself emotionally. And it's this condition that, little by little, transforms the desire to be seen into the urge to withdraw. Not forever. Just long enough to remember who you are, without the noise of all the outside expectations. Over time, the need to adjust yourself creates small internal ruptures. Every time you don't speak your truth, every emotion you suppress, every time you swallow the urge to be authentic just to avoid causing discomfort, something breaks. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, but continuously. You keep going, of course. Still functioning, still polite, still socially pleasant. But inside, a silent conflict takes root. The version of you that the world sees starts to dangerously drift away from what you actually feel. This process isn't intentional. It happens as a survival strategy. It's the mind trying to protect the soul from the exhaustion of being rejected, ridiculed, or ignored. But eventually, that distance between who you are and who you present to the world turns into a kind of emptiness that's hard to name. A sort of absence of self within your own presence. You're there, but you don't feel whole. You speak, but don't hear yourself. You smile, but don't recognize your own expression. And that misalignment comes at a cost. Repressed emotions don't vanish, they hide. And when they don't find space to consciously exist, they start emerging in other ways. Unexplained irritability, persistent apathy, a growing disconnection from things that once made sense. It's as if your soul, tired of splitting itself in two, begins to go silent. Not by choice, but out of exhaustion. Living like this, torn between who you are and who you're expected to be, wears down even the desire to keep trying. Because deep down, there's a constant feeling of being a fraud. You know you're not being true to yourself. You know you're sacrificing your essence just to be accepted. And that awareness hurts, because part of you is still screaming for freedom, while another part tries not to make noise in order to keep being welcomed. What remains unexpressed eventually finds a way to show itself, and the body, so often ignored in this inner process of denial, ends up becoming the messenger. First comes a fatigue that no rest seems to cure. Then, constant tension in the shoulders, the muscles, the breath. Aches with no clear cause. Sleep that doesn't bring rest. The constant sensation of being on the verge of collapse, even when everything on the outside looks normal. This state is not weakness. It's overload. It's the body trying to manage what the mind has been forced to hide for too long. When you stay silent so you don't disturb others, when you disconnect from yourself just to maintain the appearance of balance, something inside starts to short-circuit. Because the body feels the weight of what your awareness hasn't been ready to face. That's when the urge to disconnect, even symbolically, starts to intensify. Because everything begins to feel like too much. The light, the noise, the obligations, the conversations. You don't want to sleep, you want to disappear for a while. Not to escape life, but to find a space where you can finally rest from the constant demand to function. A place where your existence isn't measured by how productive, cheerful, or emotionally stable you are. Unfortunately, this language of the body is rarely recognized as a deep sign of disconnection. It's usually handled with haste, medication, or empty phrases. And when that happens, the pain builds up. The soul becomes too heavy to carry without physical consequences. The body isn't sick, it's begging for truth, for someone to listen, for space. It becomes the last resource when every other form of expression has been silenced. Few people understand this, but the desire to step away from life is not necessarily a rejection of the world. It's often a silent plea for relief, for peace. For a moment without the pressure to perform, hold it together, or keep going. It's not a wish for everything to end, but a longing for a break from the overwhelming weight of it all. It's the urge to disappear just long enough to breathe without judgment, without expectations, without having to explain what you barely understand yourself. This desire is often mistaken for weakness. But what most people don't realize is that it comes from the strength of someone who has endured too much for too long. Someone who stayed present even when everything around them felt disconnected. Someone who felt deeply, tried repeatedly, insisted, until they no longer knew what to do with all that feeling. In many cases, it's not a lack of love for life. It's an excess of clarity about the pain it contains. We must be careful not to judge this kind of feeling, because it doesn't come from a shallow place. It comes from the depth of a soul that finds itself torn between its truth and the constant need to adapt. And when adapting becomes the rule, the essence starts pleading for time away from the world. Not to get lost, but to find itself again. Honoring that impulse means recognizing that there are valid forms of suffering that don't fit into diagnoses or motivational quote. That the desire not to be, at certain moments, is the unconscious quietly saying, "I need silence." And maybe, if we can hear that with sensitivity, this plea won't lead to permanent disconnection from life, but to a return to it, one that is more real and whole. As paradoxical as it may seem, it's often in the moments of greatest discomfort that the first signs of change begin to emerge. When everything inside you feels too heavy, too confusing, directionless, maybe it's not the end of something, but the beginning. The beginning of a new way of being in the world, one that's more aligned with what truly matters. Pain doesn't only come to hurt. Sometimes it comes to show you just how far you've drifted from yourself. Jean-Paul Sartre once said that man is condemned to be free. That freedom, far from being a light privilege, is a difficult and constant call to take responsibility for oneself. We're thrown into the world without a script, without a defined role, and we have to choose who to be over and over again. That choice, even when silent, is a source of anguish. But it's also a doorway, a turning point. When the desire not to exist shows up, it might be pointing to that threshold, the moment when you can no longer keep pretending, when it becomes necessary to stop the automatic flow of life and honestly face your own essence. In this context, suffering stops being punishment and becomes a compass. It reveals where it hurts not because it wants to harm, but because something there has been forgotten, denied, or left dormant. It's in that space between pain and awareness that the process of transformation begins. A transition that doesn't happen quickly or without pain, but one that can open the way to a more authentic existence. The wish to disappear may, deep down, be the first spark of a new desire to live, but to live in a different way, one that doesn't injure your soul, that doesn't require masks, and that welcomes every part of who you are. For Jung, certain types of suffering are signs that something essential is being ignored. When life loses its color and everything feels meaningless, it may be the soul trying to speak. That desire to vanish is often a symbol of deep exhaustion, not from life itself, but from the distance between who you are and who you feel pressured to appear to be. Jung called this process individuation, a return to one's own truth. It's not about changing the world, but about stopping the inner divide. In this context, pain is a form of language, a legitimate impulse from the psyche, searching for wholeness. And listening to it carefully can be the first step in finding meaning again. Maybe you can't change the world, or the pace of things, or the shallowness around you. But you can still care for your center, that quiet space within you where all that is real reside. You don't have to force optimism or pretend to feel light. But you can begin with small gestures of returning to yourself. And as hard as it may seem, here are some possible paths. Be mindful of who you listen to. Surround yourself with people who are present and respectful of your pace. One real conversation is worth more than 100 empty interactions. Recognize your value even when no one else does. You don't feel too much, you feel completely. And that, while it comes at a cost, is exactly what the world needs most. Channel your emotions. Paint, write, play music. Go for a walk, connect with nature, immerse yourself in silence, feel the wind on your face. Give your soul a space to express itself beyond word. Seek help when the burden feels too heavy. That's not weakness, it's clarity. Talking to someone prepared can be the first step toward breathing in truth again. And above all, never forget to look within. The answers you've been searching for are already inside you. Sometimes, all the soul needs is to be heard, to pause, and to reconnect. The magic begins when you start taking care of yourself. Because, little by little, you begin to attract what resonates with your essence. More honest relationships, lighter spaces, silences that nourish. And all of that happens if you choose it. The dream is the most real thing there is. That phrase comes from a book that deeply moved me, and it might touch you too. The name of the book is The Alchemist, and it was a turning point in my life. If you'd like to check it out, I'll leave the link in the first comment.